So I mentioned how excommunication, the being forbidden from receiving communion, was something that really scared medieval people, even though it happened fairly commonly with kings and lords, not really with ordinary people. But it was a way to get people to toe the line, because if you can't receive communion, you're not in God's good books. And people were scared of that. In motivating belief that would have affected even ordinary people, though, was purgatory. Now, purgatory was believed throughout the Middle Ages. It actually didn't become dogma. That means like official church policy until 1274, but it was really commonplace before that, because medieval people believed in ghosts, they believed in spirits. There are loads of stories from the Middle Ages about how people were visited from the dead. And people were naturally frightened of coming across a ghost in these medieval ghost tales. Rarely were they the kind of ghosts that we get in movies today. In fact, a medieval person, if they went to the movies and watched any of our ghostly horror stories or poltergeist stories, they wouldn't get it at all, because their ghosts did not come back really to haunt or torment the living. Instead, they were usually appearing to people that they knew when they were alive, and they usually wanted something from them. So a lot of this ties in with the concept of purgatory, and this concept was fully realized in the medieval period. And it's when a person dies, their soul doesn't automatically go to heaven or hell. Instead, the belief was that if you were a Christian, the soul needed to be purified before entering paradise. That you could have had a perfect life, but you're still going to have something you need to work off in purgatory. So in purgatory, souls would get tortured and punished for their sins, so they were purified for the ascent into heaven. And so this meant that the medieval people believed that the living world could help the dead in getting out of purgatory. Mainly praying for their souls was the number one way of helping them out. And this in turn kind of, we see things like private beliefs in Christianity coming to the fore in the Middle Ages, long before the Reformation, because people wanted to worship in a private way so that they could look after their friends and loved ones in purgatory. And if you were wealthy enough, you could construct your own private chapel for this. So by the late Middle Ages, it was very popular to leave money in your wills to hire priests to perform mass for your soul, and to allow for you to be buried within a church. Again, reduce your time in purgatory. Alternatively, people would donate some of their land to a monastery or a religious order, and in exchange they would say mass for their souls. They'd say, they gave us the way to support lots of monks or nuns, and we're so grateful for their support. We're going to pray for them so they have a better time in purgatory. So a lot of these ghost stories in the Middle Ages involve souls that are in purgatory, but they're contacting their living relatives or friends to ask them to do something that would help relieve their suffering and assist them in entering heaven. And these could range anywhere from, I died before I could pay my debts back, or I had a vow that needs fulfilled, or just making sure that they're being prayed for, just as a, hey, just you remember me now, you pray for me. So I'm now going to tell you a medieval ghost story. And I want you to think about, if you're a medieval person and it's a cold and dark and spooky night and you're told this ghost story, what would you take away from it? Okay, so this is a ghost story told by the Norman monk Orderic Vitalis. So he's writing in the 11th century, Orderic. Anyway, he tells the story of his friend, because it's always my friend. But his friend, a priest named Walchelin, was returning home. He was traveling along the road, far from any homes, when he heard the sounds of a great army coming towards him. Walchelin thinks, right, I'm getting to the side here because they'll flatten me otherwise. And he stood to the side and watched as thousands of people started to walk by. First came the peasants. To Walchelin, they seemed to be a mob of people who were carrying off the plunder from an attack. Then came hundreds of women, riding side saddle on horses, but the saddles were marked with red-hot nails. As the woman rode, they would jump off their saddles and into the air and then land back on the nails, leaving them burned and stabbed and bloody. After them came a crowd of priests, monks, even bishops and abbots, all dressed in black and groaning and lamenting as they passed by. Next followed a great army of knights, in which no colour was visible except blackness and flickering fire. All the knights rode upon huge horses, fully armed as if they were galloping into battle and carrying jet black standards. What scared Walchelin so much was that he recognised so many of these people. They were his neighbours, they were his fellow clergy, but he recognised them, and they had all died in recent years. There were even people that Walchelin and others had thought to be good Christians, even considered saints in their lives on earth, but they were here too, walking with the army of the dead. The worst of the group were being carried on biers, suffering terrible punishments. And I'm just going to quote here from Orderic Vitalis. On the biers sat men as small as dwarfs, but with huge heads like barrels. One enormous tree trunk was borne by 2 Ethiopians, and on the trunk some wretch tightly trussed was suffering tortures, screaming aloud in his dreadful agony. A fearful demon sitting on the same trunk was mercilessly goading his back and loins with red-hot spurs while he streamed with blood. Walchelin at once recognised him as the slayer of the priest Stephen, and realised that he was suffering unbearable torments for his guilt in shedding innocent blood not 2 years before, for he had died without completing his penance for the terrible crime. So the story goes on, and Knight identifies himself, and he tells Walchelin, and the reader, about how his sins in life are punishing him in death. Walchelin then finds his own brother, who'd been a knight who had very recently died. His brother tells him, another quote, "I have endured severe punishment for the great sins with which I am heavily burdened. The arms which we bear are red hot and offend us with an appalling stench, weighing us down with intolerable weight and burning with everlasting fire. Up to now I have suffered unspeakable torture from these punishments. But when you were ordained in England and sang your first mass for the faithful departed, your father Ralph escaped from his punishments, and my shield, which caused me great pain, fell from me. As you see, I still carry this sword, but I look in faith for release from this burden within the year." So Walchelin's brother asks him for prayers, charitable giving to lessen his time in purgatory, and he tells Walchelin, "Correct your life wisely, for it is stained by many vices, and you must know that it will not be long enduring." So one of your questions is going to be about what the takeaways you would get from that story, but a lot of things that medieval people did were done with the intent of shortening their time in purgatory. They were terrified of it. The other thing that they were there for, they did certain things which they thought were going to help them out in the long run. And one of them was a association with saints. So saints are still very important in the Catholic Church today. They're integral to the church today because, you still can't even have a consecrated church unless there's some relics there. Let's say where relics are shortly. But in the Middle Ages, it really is like mass obsession. It's a whole different ballgame to what religion is like today. So this is a good class for remembering as well that religion is not constant, religious beliefs are not constant, rather they change over time and are hugely influenced by culture as well. So saints were really popular in the medieval Catholic Church. Because medieval saints were engaged, they were interactive, they were pervasive. There was a patron saint of names, and that would be like your second birthday, your patron saint's holy day, rather. For ailments, so if you had a particular disease, you'd ask for help from the patron saint of that disease. Or if you were, your town or your village, your church have their own patron saint, your occupation its own patron saint. So they were really pervasive in people's lives back then. They would have known an awful lot about them. And that's really actually very important too when we're considering about educating people into being good Christians. Now, the Bible could not be translated out of Latin. That was the case until comparatively recently. Latin was the language of the elite in the Middle Ages. But of course, ordinary people wouldn't be able to read and write at this time period. It changes later in the Middle Ages, but they wouldn't be able to read and write. And if they could, they wouldn't be able to read and write Latin. But at the same time, they needed to be able to communicate to ordinary people what was in the Bible, what makes you a good Christian. And this is where the lives of the saints come in. These are called the hagiographies or the vitas. Vitas Latin for life. And they were really, really, really popular in the Middle Ages because they could be in the local language. So the saints were seen as an integral way to educate the population, a vital way to support Christian teachings in a way that people could understand. So if people weren't literate, this was a way to get them to understand the things that they really, really needed to know in order to be good Christians. So the importance of saints impacts the medieval use of relics, and they were also obsessed with relics. You still do have to have some for consecration, right? But medieval people, not like modern day Christians at all. In the Middle Ages, they were even more the focal point of church, worship, and community. The fact that there was a tangible thing connected to a saint really helped people feel connected to their religion as a whole, because, this is European-wide. It's enormous in scale. But if you had a relic, that's a way for you as an ordinary person to see how you fit into the big picture. Body parts were super important because it was believed that the spirit of the saint stayed with them. And so these relics and the actual tangible body parts associated with the saint were very popular ways of spreading Christianity. Now you might think, this sounds a bit like idolatry, and the Bible's pretty clear about idolatry. But St. Thomas Aquinas, who is like one of the most famous Christian theologian thinkers, and especially of the Middle Ages, he wrote a threefold defense of the cult of relics. He argued that, number one, the relic was a physical reminder of the saint, and therefore it made it easier for people to understand the importance of the saint and therefore Christianity as a whole. His second reason why the cult of the relics was cool was because the saint worked miracles through it. Right? You could ask a saint for a miracle, but it isn't the saint who's performing the miracle. It's God through the saint that's performing the miracle. So because the body performs the miracle, it's in and of itself an important and valuable item. Thirdly and finally, because miracles were performed through relics, this shows that God must approve of the cult of relics, because it's God who makes the miracles, and the miracles wouldn't happen if God didn't like it. End of. That's the medieval equivalent of mic drop. It was also a way of getting income for your church, because, if you were an ordinary person in the Middle Ages, you might go on what we call pilgrimage. So you would do religious travel just to see, maybe a saint you've got a special connection with, or really just to get out of the house and get out of work and go on vacation for a while. So it was a way to get income, donations, raise the profile of your church. The problem was that it could go too far. Even in the Middle Ages, they said it went too far. And that was when it got into the grounds of theft and faking. And medieval, they tried to justify the thievery and the fakery, but even a lot of medieval people weren't necessarily convinced by that. So, for example, there were 3 heads of St. John the Baptist at some point. Obviously, going to be 2 of them that are fake, not the heads of John the Baptist. But I've got a couple of pictures here. I've got the body of St. Lucy here, who's a Roman saint, and the head of St. Catherine. Some flipping awesome miracles associated with the head of St. Catherine that you can read about. But of course, you would expect the Pope's going to have the best relics. So the Pope's private chapel in Rome contained, among other things, the umbilical cord of Christ, the foreskin of Christ in a gold and jeweled crucifix and preserved in oil, along with a piece of the true cross, the heads of the Saints Peter and Paul, the Ark of the Covenant, so there you go guys, not Indiana Jones, the tablets of Moses, the rod of Aaron, a golden urn of manna, the tunic of the Virgin, various pieces of clothing worn by John the Baptist, including his hair shirt, the 5 loaves, the 2 fishes which fed the 5,000, and the table used at the Last Supper. Now, you do not need to be a very good Christian to recognise those as being big hitters of the Bible. So, why this obsession with relics? Well, they attributed a lot of divine powers to them. Miracles, this was the main way of God expressing his view on how things were going on earth. Also, remember, we're dealing with a very different time culturally. So this was a major way for people to feel a closer connection to their religion. Today, people pray using their own Bible. They contemplate the scriptures. That is not an option back in the Middle Ages for people. And a lot of these saints, as I said, they are not the ones working the miracle. It's God. They are the intercessors. They're interceding on a person's behalf. Now, I want you to go and look at more of these relics and reliquaries on this very cool website next, and you're going to tell me about a relic or a reliquary that you've learned about from that website. Now, a relic is the item associated with the saint and can be a bit of the saint themselves, and the reliquary is the blingtastic, usually, item that the relic is stored in. So, for example, here on the head of St. Catherine, her relic's her head. The reliquary is this beautiful silver and bejeweled box that it's contained within, and that's there to look after it, but also to impress people. I mean, if you're a medieval person, right, and you make a pilgrimage because you're really fond of St. Catherine, say, I mean, you'd be amazed at seeing her head, but you'd also be like, oh my God, look at this art. I've never seen anything like that. It would have just taken their breath away. So go find out more about relics and reliquaries.